Stop what you're doing and pull out a dollar bill. Go ahead. I'll wait. Look at the top. See those words? Federal Reserve Note. Now ask yourself this question. If that dollar is a note, which is just another word for debt, an IOU, a promise to pay, then who owes what to whom? The Federal Reserve created that dollar. They didn't mine it from the ground. They didn't inherit it. They didn't tax anyone to get it. They created it from literally nothing, just digits on a computer screen. Numbers appearing because someone at the Fed typed them in. But if that dollar represents debt and the Fed created it from thin air, who is the Fed in debt to? Think about it for a second. When you sign a car loan, you get the money, but you owe the bank. You're in debt. But the Fed creates money without borrowing it from anyone. So who's the creditor? Who does the Federal Reserve owe? The answer breaks most people's brains because when you finally understand it, you realize the entire monetary system, everything you thought you knew about money, is designed to transfer wealth from your paycheck to private banking institutions. And it's been happening since 1913. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. Public record. Information hiding in plain sight that most people never bother to look at. If you want to understand who really controls the economy, who profits from every dollar of national debt, and why you'll work your entire life paying interest on money that was created from nothing, then don't touch that skip button. Like this video right now. Hit subscribe, because what I'm about to explain will change how you see every paycheck, every tax payment, and every dollar in your wallet forever. Drop a comment if you've ever wondered where money actually comes from. This is the story of the greatest financial con in American history, and you've been paying for it your entire life. Let's start with something most Americans get completely wrong. The Federal Reserve isn't federal, and it has no reserves. I know that sounds like one of those edgy internet claims, but stay with me because this is documented, verifiable fact that you can check yourself. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 by an act of Congress called the Federal Reserve Act. Most people assume that makes it a government agency, like the IRS or the Treasury Department or the Postal Service. It's not. The Federal Reserve System consists of 12 regional banks: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, Richmond, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Kansas City, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Dallas. Each of these 12 Federal Reserve banks is a private corporation, not government agencies. Private corporations with shareholders, and those shareholders are commercial banks. The biggest banks in America. J.P. Morgan Chase owns shares in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So does Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley. These aren't just banks using the Federal Reserve. They literally just own pieces of it. Here's how it works. Every commercial bank that's part of the Federal Reserve System, which includes every major bank you've heard of, is required by law to buy stock in their regional Federal Reserve Bank. Not metaphorical ownership, actual stock certificates, actual shares. And those shares pay dividends, 6% annually, guaranteed. Written into law. No matter what happens to the economy, no matter if there's a recession or a boom, no matter if inflation is at 2% or 10%, member banks receive a 6% annual return and on their Federal Reserve shares. Risk-free, guaranteed by law, paid before any profits go to the Treasury. Let me say that again. The Federal Reserve is legally required to pay private banks 6% dividends annually before a single dollar goes to the government. Now, there is a board of governors in Washington, D.C., 7 people appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. This creates the illusion of government control. It's brilliant marketing. But here's what actually happens. The Board of Governors sets policy. They decide things like interest rates and money supply targets. But the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the private ones, the ones owned by commercial banks, do all the actual work. They create the money. They interact with banks. They hold the assets. They execute the transactions. And they're owned by private banks. Each regional Fed has a board of 9 directors. Want to guess who elects 6 of those 9 directors? The member banks, the private banks that own shares. So private banks elect 2/3 of the leadership of their regional Federal Reserve Bank. Those directors then choose the president of that regional Fed, and the presidents of the regional Feds sit on the Federal Open Market Committee, the group that makes all major monetary policy decisions. It's a circle, a perfectly designed loop that gives private banks control over the money supply while maintaining the appearance of government oversight. Okay, so the Federal Reserve is a private banking cartel with the power to create money. Let's talk about how that actually works, because this is where the scam becomes obvious. Imagine Congress passes a federal budget. They need to spend $6 trillion this year, but tax revenue is only $4.5 trillion. That's a $1.5 trillion shortfall, a deficit. The government needs to borrow $1.5 trillion. Here's what happens. Step 1. The Treasury Department issues bonds. These are IOUs. The government promises to pay back the money plus interest over time. They issue $1.5 trillion in Treasury bonds and auction them off to whoever wants to buy them. Foreign governments buy some: China, Japan, Saudi Arabia. Pension funds buy some, mutual funds, insurance companies, and banks. Step 2. The Federal Reserve decides to buy $500 billion worth of these bonds. This is called quantitative easing or open market operations, depending on the specific mechanism. Doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is what happens next. Step 3. Here's the magic trick. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion to buy these treasury bonds? You'd think they need to have the money already, right? That they collected it somewhere. From taxes, maybe, or deposits, or profits from previous operations. No, they don't have the money, they create it. Here's literally, and I mean literally, how it works. A Federal Reserve official opens the central bank's computer system. They navigate to the Treasury's account. They type in $500,000. They hit enter. And the money exists. That's it. No gold was moved. No assets were sold. No vault was opened. No physical currency was printed. The Federal Reserve credited the Treasury's account with $500 billion that didn't exist 1 second earlier. They created it by typing numbers into a computer. Now that $500 billion enters circulation. The Treasury spends it. Government contractors get paid. Social Security checks go out. Military salaries get deposited. The money flows through the economy. But, and this is critical, the government now owes the Federal Reserve $500 billion plus interest. Let's say 3% interest. That's $15 billion per year, every year, until the bonds mature. Where does the government get $15 billion to pay that interest? From you, your taxes. Here's where the math becomes impossible. This is the part that proves the system is designed to create permanent, unpayable debt. When the Federal Reserve creates $500 billion to buy Treasury bonds, they create the principal, the $500 billion. But they don't create the interest, the $15 billion annual interest payment. That interest has to come from dollars that already exist somewhere else in the economy, which means someone else has to go into debt to create those dollars, or the government has to borrow even more. Let me illustrate this with simple numbers. Imagine an economy with only 100 in existence. The government borrows all 100 from the Fed at 10% interest. The government now owes 110, but only 100 exists. Where does the extra $10 come from? It doesn't exist. It can't be paid. The debt is mathematically impossible to fully repay. The only solution is to create more money, which means borrowing more, which creates more interest, which creates more debt. It's exponential. The debt grows faster than the money supply because interest isn't created along with the principal. This is why the U.S. national debt is $36 trillion and growing by $2 trillion every year, despite collecting $4.5 trillion in taxes annually. The math doesn't work. It's not supposed to work. The system is designed to create unpayable debt that generates permanent interest payments. And where do those interest payments go? In 2023, the federal government spent over $650 billion just on interest payments for the national debt. Not paying down the principal, just interest. $650 billion of your tax dollars went to interest payments. And a huge portion of that goes to the Federal Reserve, which then pays its expenses, pays dividends to member banks, and sends the remainder to the Treasury. But think about what that means. The Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, charges the government interest on it, collects that interest from your taxes, pays itself and its member banks, and sends back whatever's left over. Here's the truth that will break your brain. The national debt can never be repaid, ever. Not because politicians are fiscally irresponsible, not because we spend too much on welfare or defense, but because the monetary system is structurally designed to require permanent debt. Let me prove it. Every dollar in circulation was created by the Federal Reserve purchasing debt, primarily treasury bonds. When the Fed buys bonds, dollars are created. When those bonds are paid off, dollars are destroyed. The total money supply equals the total debt. They're two sides of the same coin. Now imagine the government decided to pay off the entire national debt, every last dollar. They'd have to collect dollars through taxes or revenue, then hand those dollars to the Federal Reserve to pay off the bonds. The Federal Reserve receives the dollars and cancels the bonds. But here's the problem. When the Fed receives dollars in payment of debt, those dollars are removed from circulation, destroyed. They cease to exist. Because remember, dollars were created when the Fed bought the bonds. Paying off the bonds reverses the process. If the government paid off all 36 trillion of national debt, it would have to collect 36 trillion from the economy and hand it to the Fed, and every single one of those dollars would be destroyed. The money supply would drop to zero. There would be no dollars left in the economy. No money to pay workers, no money in bank accounts, no money to buy anything. Instant economic collapse. This is why the national debt has grown every single year since 1913, with one brief exception I'll get to. The debt can't be repaid because doing so would eliminate all money. As the economy grows, you need more money in circulation. The only way to create more money in this system is for the government to borrow more from the Fed. More borrowing creates more debt, creates more interest, creates more borrowing. It's a perpetual cycle, by design. A few American presidents understood this scam and tried to stop it. They didn't fare well. In 1830, Andrew Jackson became the only president in U.S. history to completely pay off the national debt. $0 owed. How did he do it? He killed the second bank of the United States, the central bank at the time, the predecessor to the Federal Reserve. Jackson called it a den of vipers and thieves. He vetoed its recharter. The bank ceased to exist. Without a central bank creating debt-based money, Jackson used revenue from land sales and tariffs to pay off every dollar of national debt. For exactly 1 year, America owed nothing. Then what happened? The Panic of 1830, one of the worst economic depressions in American history. Why? Because without new debt being created, the money supply contracted, businesses failed, banks collapsed, unemployment soared. Jackson's experiment proved that in a debt-based monetary system, you cannot eliminate debt without eliminating money. In 1963, John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 11110. It authorized the Treasury Department to issue United States notes, currency backed by silver reserves, created by the government, not the Federal Reserve. Kennedy wanted to bypass the Fed entirely, create debt-free money. The Treasury printed $4.3 billion in United States notes. They said United States note at the top instead of Federal Reserve note. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson became president. One of his first acts was to quietly halt the issuance of United States notes. The $4.3 billion that had been printed were withdrawn from circulation. We went back to Federal Reserve notes exclusively. Coincidence? Maybe. But the pattern is clear. Presidents who challenge the Federal Reserve's control over money face severe consequences. Abraham Lincoln issued greenbacks during the Civil War, debt-free currency printed directly by the Treasury. Assassinated. James Garfield gave speeches about the danger of private banks controlling the money supply. He said, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." Assassinated within weeks. These are historical facts, public record, not theories, and the Federal Reserve's power remained intact through all of it. Let's answer the question everyone's been waiting for. Who owns the Federal Reserve? This isn't some secret conspiracy, it's public information. You can look it up, but nobody does. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful of the 12 regional Fed banks because it executes all the open market operations, is owned by its member banks. And the biggest shareholders are JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley Bank of America Wells Fargo. These banks don't just use the Federal Reserve. They own it. They're shareholders. They elect the leadership. They receive dividends. The same banks that crashed the economy in 2008. The same banks that received $700 billion in taxpayer-funded bailouts. The same banks that paid executives multi-million-dollar bonuses while Americans lost their homes. Those banks own the institution that creates money. They own the money printer. And here's the beautiful criminal genius of it. The Federal Reserve is structured so that its ownership is opaque. They don't publish a public list of shareholders and their stake sizes. There's no stock ticker you can check. But we know who the largest owners are because of their size, their representation on the boards, and their required share purchases based on their capital levels. In Q3, the Federal Reserve made about $58 billion in profit. They paid roughly $2 billion in dividends to member banks. Profit made from interest collected on bonds they bought with money created from nothing. Money that cost them zero to create. Think about that business model. Create an asset from nothing. Charge interest on it. Collect that interest from taxpayers. Pay yourself first. Send the leftovers to the government. It's the most profitable scam ever devised. Comment scam if you finally understand why the system is designed this way. Let's trace a dollar from your paycheck to a bank's profit statement. You work 40 hours. Your employer pays you $1,000. The government takes $250 in taxes. You net $750. That $250 in taxes goes to the Treasury. The course Treasury uses it for government operations, but a huge portion goes to interest payments on the national debt. In 2024, over $650 billion in tax revenue went purely to interest payments. Not roads, not schools, not defense, just interest. Of that $650 billion, hundreds of billions flow to the Federal Reserve as interest on the Treasury bonds they hold. The Federal Reserve collected approximately $170 billion in interest income in 2023. They paid operating expenses of about $5 billion. They paid dividends to member banks of $2 billion. They sent $58 billion to the Treasury. That's only $65 billion was counted for. Where did the other $105 billion go? Reserve capital, complex accounting, and mechanisms the average person doesn't see or understand. But the point is clear. Money flows from your paycheck through the government to the Federal Reserve and ultimately to the private banks that own it. You work, banks profit, and the mechanism enabling this wealth transfer is the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money creation and its ability to charge interest on money created from nothing. This has been operating for 111 years. Since 1913, trillions, literally trillions, have been transferred from American workers to the banking system through this mechanism, all perfectly legal, because the banks wrote the law. If you're feeling angry right now, good. That anger is appropriate. Channel it into understanding. Subscribe so you never forget how this works. Share this so others can see it too. So let's finally answer the question we started with. If the Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, who do they owe it to? The answer is nobody. The Federal Reserve creates dollars by purchasing assets, primarily Treasury bonds. They don't borrow the money from anyone. There's no lender, no creditor. They are the source. The Federal Reserve doesn't owe anyone, but the government owes the Federal Reserve. That's the con. The Fed creates dollars to buy government bonds. The government gets the dollars and spends them. But now the government owes the Fed the principal plus interest, and the Federal Reserve is owned by private banks. So the chain of ownership and debt looks like this. Private banks own the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve creates money from nothing. The Federal Reserve lends that money to the government. The government owes the Fed principal and interest. The government collects taxes from you. Your taxes pay the interest. The interest goes to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve pays its expenses and dividends. Private banks profit. Your tax dollars pay interest to a private banking cartel on money that was created from nothing. The Federal Reserve owes nobody, but everyone owes the Federal Reserve. Every dollar in your wallet is Federal Reserve note, literally a debt instrument. You're holding physical evidence of debt that the government owes to private banks. And that debt can never be fully repaid because if it were, there would be no money. The system requires permanent, exponentially growing debt, which generates permanent interest payments, which transfers wealth from working Americans to banking institutions. Forever. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was the largest transfer of power in American history. It gave private banks the legal right to create money, lend it to the government, and charge interest on it forever. Before 1913, the government could create money. After 1913, the government had to borrow money from a private cartel. That's not capitalism. That's not free markets. That's not democracy. That's a system designed by banks, for banks to extract wealth from everyone else. The national debt is $36 trillion. It will never be paid off. It will only grow. Every year, more of your tax dollars go to interest payments. Interest that enriches the same banks that own the money printer. The Federal Reserve doesn't owe anyone, but you owe them, your government owes them, your children will owe them. And the beautiful, terrible genius of it is that most people have no idea. They think money is printed by the government. They think the Federal Reserve is federal. They think the national debt is just irresponsible spending. But now you know better, because the more people who understand this, the harder it becomes to pretend it's not happening. The Federal Reserve doesn't owe anyone. But the real question is, how long are you willing to keep paying them? Subscribe for more videos that explain what they don't want you to know about money, banking, and economic control. This is just the beginning. See you in the next one. And remember, every dollar in your wallet is someone else's debt. Make sure you understand whose.